like to introduce Timothy Mitchell, who again really does not need any introduction, at least not at SOAS. He is indeed the William V. Ransford Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Columbia University, and amongst his many influential works are Colonizing Egypt, Rule of Experts, Technopolitics, Egypt Modernity, I think I got that wrong, Egypt Technopolitics Modernity, Carbon Democracy. His work, his teaching and his mentorship have really shaped and I think continue to shape a generation of scholars working on the Middle East, not just in the fields of Middle East studies and history and politics, but many fields far out of it. And of course, his work is a huge part of the way in which we teach and we learn at an institution like SOAS. And I think it's fair to say, especially after this seminar series and the kinds of conversations that we've been having, that we're still very much working either within the paradigm that he established as early as 1988, or many of our speakers are working against it. And I think that itself says something about the influence and the durability of his work. So I think I share many people's sentiments in this room when I say that it's really a pleasure to have you with us here today, and a real privilege that you have chosen to share the drafts of your forthcoming book with us at SOAS. So without further ado, please give him a round of applause.
Thank you very much, Hanny, for that introduction and for organizing this, and to Sarah and Martine for co-organizing this. It's wonderful to be here. I moved to Columbia about 5 years ago, and as part of that move, we formed this new department, MISAS, Middle East, South Asian, and African Studies, which has a certain resemblance to SOAS, and I think partly because some of the faculty were part of it, in particular Dr. WRCHR, my colleague in South Asian politics, was for much of his career here at SOAS. And we started actually to refer to ourselves as SOAS on the Hudson. And I always feel, and we've also had a very large proportion of our most excellent PhD students come through SOAS. One of them sitting next to me. So it's wonderful to actually be here in person and to recognize that intellectual connection. So let me try and keep this brief. I don't usually drop chapters like music tracks, as these have been dropped on an audience. So I was a little hesitant about doing so, because this is very much a work in progress, and the full album is a long way from being ready to release. Well, it's meant to be done within about 6 months, but we'll see. And part of that sense that it's not ready yet is that I don't even have a title for the book. And one of the things I'd like to get out of this interaction with you is some suggestions for a title. I brought this up last night after the lecture I did, and part of that lecture looked at the history of the idea of the truck system, the kind of barter system, which is mentioned briefly in the chapter here, but as one way to think about a certain moment in economic history, and proposed that the invention of the economy in the mid-20th century could be seen as a sort of reproduction of the truck system, a certain relationship between goods and money. So the best suggestion I got last night for the book title was Keep on Trucking. If you can improve on that, it would be great, because that's not going to work. The book had its origins partly in wanting to write, in some ways, a sequel to my book, Carbon Democracy, and to think about the politics of the climate crisis in particular. And to do so, as I was already doing in that book and in previous writing, to think about that through the need to try and further undo the grip of economics as a discipline and economic thought on the way we organize and approach our politics. And within that grip, to try and think more critically about some of the key concepts, including the notion of growth itself. So not just to say, well, we need to be anti-growth now, but to understand how, for example, the very conception of growth came into being and was organized and is used. And as part of that, or what that comes out of, is not only my interest in the history of oil and energy, but also this history of economics that evolved over the last 2 or more decades since my discovery that it was only in the middle part of the 20th century that economists began talking about an object called the economy. That it was something that had been constructed in a certain way somewhere in the middle of the 20th century. And I'd written about that in a number of articles and in parts of books. But in order to sort of further think through the problems that the economy gives us as a way of understanding our forms of collective life, I started to ask myself, well, what was the economy an answer to? What was it invented to solve in the mid-20th century? And very crudely and briefly, there were 2 things that seemed to me significant. One was a certain crisis of empire, of a system of world empires that had been assembled over the previous 2 centuries or more, and that was finally coming undone in the interwar period. And the other was a crisis of something much more recent, something that had come to be called business. One of the things in trying to see what the economy was a response to was to think about what kinds of terms there were prior to the invention of the term economy. And one of the most prevalent ones from the late 19th century through to the mid-20th century was the conception of business, the notion of business cycles, business crises, all kinds of ways in which business itself sort of provided the kind of collective term for thinking about certain ways of organizing collective life in that period. And that this was clearly itself in some kind of crisis, obviously with the crash of 1929, the Great Depression, but the wider sense that the forms of capitalist life that business represented had found themselves incapable of functioning and surviving. So I began thinking about that notion of business as a category. And its rise in the late 19th century is associated with and attempting to grasp a phenomenon of that period, very closely connected to the history of colonialism and empire in that period, and that is the phenomenon of the joint stock company, the modern business corporation. So I began to think of this project as being about this concept of business, of the joint stock company, and the relations to those 2 moments in the history of colonization and empire. The approach I developed to thinking about this new kind of business organization was different from the way that had normally been talked about, whether in terms of colonial history or in histories of the United States and other places, which tended to write about the rise of the large corporation as a kind of solution to a problem of doing things at great scale, and particularly associated with the building of transcontinental railways in other parts of the world that seemed to require a kind of managerial organization and the organizing of capital on a new scale. That seemed to me to be the wrong way round, and that what was most distinctive about these new forms of activity, epitomized by the railway in the 19th century, by oil companies from the early 20th century, was the extraordinary durability of the structures that they were building. They were putting in place apparatuses of various kinds, railway lines, oil installations, other kinds of infrastructure of energy and urban life and so on, that promised a revenue over a much longer period of time than the kinds of economic organization perhaps typical of earlier periods. And that durability was, first of all, kind of technical durability. It was the durability of iron and steel, of concrete, of other forms of organizing infrastructure and other apparatuses that, while it would need constant repair and renewal, for various reasons, seem to have this durability of 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And with that notion of durability, which is how I first thought of this project, though I've reframed it, one had a history of a new kind of not just technical organization of infrastructure, but a new kind of a new apparatus for the capturing of revenue. And of course, the revenue that a railway company captures is the fares that passengers will pay, the charges that freight will earn for being carried, and so on. And so you had an apparatus of capture of revenue that was built out in such a way that it might reliably capture that revenue for the next 10, 20, 50 years or whatever. And you could do something new with that, not entirely new, but on a new scale, which is you could take that future revenue and find a way to sell it to others in the present. So the share of the shareholding company was not some way of necessarily amassing small amounts of money to pay for the new apparatus, as people often think of shareholding in a large corporation. That was a way of sharing out, of devising up and making divisible that future that could be captured thanks to the durability of the technical apparatus that was being built. And to give you a size of the significance of something like railways, something like 90% of the shares being traded on the new stock exchanges that expanded rapidly in this period in the later 19th century were the shares of railway companies. These were the things that were being captured, divided up, and sold to investors. And that selling of the future, that capture and selling of the future, seemed to me the most important aspect of this era of business and of the crisis that the economy was invented to solve, because that future can be captured, but it can only be captured if you not only build it out technically through these new kinds of forms of durable technical apparatus, but if you build it out politically, because the value of that future, although you've got to discount it somewhat when you sell it to investors in the present, that value is dependent upon the political stability of the future, both the monopoly rights of the enterprise, but also the wider system of laws of property and so on. So that guarantee that revenue going forwards. And that's important not only when this happens, say, in Europe, but even more so as you're building out these durable apparatuses of revenue capture in colonial context, for example. And that we're going to actually sort of write a whole history of the state as, in part, as it's transformed in the later 19th century, as some of the political forms and legal forms that help constitute, alongside the technical means, this durability of new modes of capturing revenue from the future. So the book became much more about the history of modes of capturing revenue from the future, and drawing on the work of a number of others who've been thinking and rethinking the history of capitalism, it led to a rethinking of the history of capitalism. What if we actually rethink capitalism not only in this moment of great sort of business expansion and colonial expansion in the late 19th century, but always as fundamentally based on modes of capture of the future, of which the joint stock company is only one recent example, albeit one that became among the most powerful political institutions, at least in the West, from the late 19th and through the 20th century. That transformation in how you think of capital, not as some surplus accumulated from the past, but as the building of a technical and political or techno-political apparatus for capturing reliably, building effective apparatuses for claiming money from the future, I think can be used, and I've tried to show in these chapters, as a much wider way to think about histories of capitalism, and particularly histories of capitalism in relation to empire. And I think in these chapters, there's two or three aspects that I've tried to focus on. One is if we think of capitalism as a process whose history, through forms of both techno-political apparatus, but also the forms of finance and credit that have to be set up to allow that taking of income from the future, and impoverishing the future by the ability to enjoy that future life in the present, which is a complicated idea that maybe will come out in discussion a bit more. First of all, where does that leave us in relation to the more conventional ways where the history of capitalism is written, where the sort of central event is the Industrial Revolution and the key institution is the factory, and the fundamental sort of point of exploitation or capture of surplus is in the feature of wage labor. And I thought, well, maybe we could just see that as a detour. And that's one of the things I've tried to do in the second of the two chapters. And a detour that represents, it's on the one hand something of a crisis in older and longer forms of capture of future that worked partly through earlier histories of the corporation, particularly the colonizing corporations, the East India Company, the Royal Africa Company, the companies that were involved in the colonization of the Americas, but also in other modes of capture, particularly slavery and slave plantations, which were organized very much through modes of credit creation and the capture of the revenue generated by enslaved persons over the whole life of slaves. So what if we saw industrialization as something that happened in a corner of Lancashire, sort of as an interruption to that? And what if we then reinterpreted what that industrial revolution was, not as a sort of switch from earlier forms of commercial capitalism and the forms of credit based on that, but as actually a sort of accidental discovery of a slightly different way of organizing credit, and that the wage itself, this principle of wage labor, was actually a rather clever reorganization of credit, because as it turns out, the wages were not paid in some kind of ready money. They were paid in credit money in ways that chapter looks at briefly. The second thing one might want to think about, and this is more the focus, one of the focuses of the first chapter, is given that the original interest in this book was about ways of thinking about climate crisis and climate politics, how does this way of thinking relate to understandings of capitalism that particularly recently have much more centered the history of capitalism in the exploitation of nature, in the continual expansion of ways of capturing cheap resources from the natural world as well as from other sources. And one of the things I was trying to do in the first chapter you read was rethink a kind of way of writing ecological history that made sense in this within this new way of thinking about capitalism. What if the capture of nature was itself something that is better understood as a particular move made in terms of not simply the sort of feeding of raw materials into an industrial process, but rather the establishing and extending of these systems of credit and future capture that I've suggested a very brief history of. And I particularly wanted to do that because I keep, whatever I write, I end up coming back to Egypt, where I've spent a lot of time and written a lot of the work I've been able to do. And I had this lingering idea from about 30 years ago, from an explanation one of the old men in the village in the south of the country where I'd done some work had told me about how the irrigation system used to work before the building of the Aswan High Dam in the 1960s, and particularly a very widespread use of water wheels set up on wells in the fields rather than just sort of peripherally set close to the river to get water from the river when the river level was low. And I'd always wanted to make sense of that. And so that becomes a little theme in the organizing of both understanding this extraordinary ecological transformation imposed on Egypt by the re-engineering of the River Nile, but also a way then of rewriting that history of agricultural and hydraulic transformation in Egypt in this larger thing, in this larger context. The third thing, all this would only make sense because it's about apparatuses of capture of the future that work through mechanisms of credit money, that one had to sort of rethink money in certain ways, and this is not really my own work, it's drawing on the work of a lot of other contemporary scholars, understanding the significance of the fact that money largely exists as credit comes into being, as credit comes to being, in other words, as a claim on the future. So if there's some process at the heart of the way we live that is involved in the capture of the future, then one's got to understand money itself. And while I draw on a lot of existing and recent scholarship on this new kinds of credit theories of money, I wanted to try and add to that this techno-political understanding of that process. And that, I think, is where that it's no good just acknowledging the fact that money is always created as credit, that it's created largely by private banks these days, and created as a claim in the future. None of that is of significance unless you can explain how it is that money as a claim on the future is organized technically and politically, which is what I'm trying to do in some of the writing about money. And then a theme that comes out of that, just finally, is that part of the reason I think we haven't been able to understand money itself as a kind of techno-political process is because built into the way we think about the world is this distinction between the real and the financial. And this was more a theme of the lecture I gave last night, but it also reappears in these chapters. How is that distinction produced as sort of fundamental to the way the economy is defined and measured, but also to the way, for example, histories of Egypt in the late 19th century are written, so that this period of the most profound transformation of the country's ecology is understood as a period of financialization, as if there was a sort of material process going on, and then that was sort of overtaken by some wave of finance that somehow seems additional to or disconnected from the material transformation. I wanted to put them back together and understand finance as something continually materially constructed out of more and more engineering of claims of the future, but at the same time understand why, despite that, we think we live in a world that can be understood in terms of the distinction between the real and the financial. Got that?
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. So I'm just going to say a couple of things about how we're going to organise the rest of the seminar. So we've got two fabulous postgraduate students who are going to be commenting on Professor Mitchell's chapters, and then we're going to give you an opportunity to respond to them. After that, we'll be opening it up to the floor. So the way that's going to work is we're going to ask you to share your questions and your comments and your reflections on the chapter. Professor Mitchell's going to keep quiet for 20 minutes whilst we sort of discuss amongst ourselves, and then we're going to ask
you want me to leave the room?
you can stay in the room, but you can't speak. And then we'll have another round of that after you do get a chance to respond. So, Sapna, would you like to go first?
Thank you. Let me begin by thanking you, Professor Mitchell, for your very generative talks yesterday and today, and for letting us be the first ones to read and comment on your unpublished work. So I'm really trying to think through some of your foundational ideas in your entire oeuvre of work, and probably see how some of them sort of extend into and come into dialogue with what we're trying to read for today, like the specific chapters that you've shared with us. So your body of work radicalizes decolonial thought for me, and not because it deconstructs some of the binaries that the advent of colonial capitalist modernity sort of organizes the world into binaries like religion, economy, race, politics, nature, science, east, west, so on and so forth. But also because it asks important questions around the very processes that brought these binaries into existence in the first place. Questions like, how were these binaries mobilized and brought into existence to sustain and nurture power by creating a discourse of presence without its absence? West in opposition to the East, human agency versus nature, etc. In other words, what kind of relationship did they share with power, which in turn was a consequence of the effect created by some of these processes spanning out on the ground? How was power built into the effect, which you now term as the economy, that these processes sort of created in the first place? And finally, how and when these processes, like that of creation of newer systems of irrigation on the Nile in Egypt, or the Detour in the creation of credit, which you very interestingly called industrialization, took on a life of their own, and what all of this meant for power structures, colonial authority, and capitalist modernity as effects that were created, that were in the process of emerging and becoming in entanglement with these processes. What work did the consequent binaries do to keep the operations of power intact? And trying to think through some of these questions, in entanglement with what we read in these chapters. So I think these chapters, instead of deconstructing any specific binaries, end up deconstructing the very homogeneity of time and space as the cornerstones of capitalist modernity. So you dissociate them, not in the sense of like divorcing them from each other, but by forging a hierarchical exploitative wedge between the two. By debunking our very easy visualization of these categories as linear progressive forces. This leaves time not as intuition of space, as Benedict Anderson, says, borrowing from Walter Benjamin, and you end up sort of critiquing in questions of modernity. So time rather, in these chapters as unfolding in the present, is not an intuitive realization of space in terms of a linear progression, but an extractive, impoverishing claim over the future, which makes the future coil back to, or coil back into, or retreat to, or always be stuck in the present. Future here is not always already, is always already imprisoned by the present. So hence, instead of moving into space as a progressive linear modality, it circles back to the present. So this cyclicality of time allows for a simultaneous breaking down of space as well into its constituent elements, which then allows us to see the unequal power relations between these collective yet individual fragments of spaces, which in turn also allows us to locate the techno-political infrastructures of colonizing the future, as you call them, in varied time-space locales, and not just in one concentrated domain. It further helps us ask important questions like whose future, colonized by whom, how, and where. And this unveils an exploitative relationship between time and space, bringing into sharp relief not just questions of financial exploitation, but also racial and ethnic discrimination and how they are built into the logic of financial extraction that the present uses the future for. And as we've been seeing in other texts and authors that have been part of this seminar series, race is by default assumed in the very process of colonization. For instance, in the case of Algeria, where Miriam Davis tells us the colonial power worked by racially segregating the colonial subject from itself as Homo Islamicus, as opposed to Homo economicus. However, your work never really explicitly talks about such relationships that are built into and work as a crutch for financial excavation in time and space and creation of credit, especially in moments where the agents of colonial capitalist power, like Ernest Crozier, are working in cahoots with the native capitalists or investors, right? So does class really trump over race in these moments, and the native capitalist gets to be at par with Crozier? And what is the relationship of the native investor with the space that is being extractive to serve somebody else's present as well as his own? Furthermore, just to extend this idea, I was also thinking, what about the farmers and small-scale merchants that get displaced in the process? both at the time of setting up new systems of irrigation on the Nile and replacing old ones, as well as at the time of setting up of infrastructures of revenue generation from the future. So if you could just, so what would it mean to really give them some kind of agency in this newer, narrative around capitalism that we're trying to build or think through? So if you could just talk a little to this vis-a-vis the time-space continuum. My second question is about the very orientation of the term effect that you say economy and credit creation are. So economy, you propose, is an effect. So it is not an abstraction or a representation or even a misrepresentation for that matter, and you sort of reiterated that yesterday as well. So, but however, my understanding of it is that it is still a performance in the sense of techno-political infrastructures and credit systems performing in real space and time to create an effect. So if the effect is neither in the realm of something called the reality as opposed to an abstraction, nor in the realm of symbolic representation, where and how does it exist? In other words, if it is neither embodied performance because it is an effect, nor discursive as in the realm of the autonomy of the signifier because it is not an abstraction, where and how does it exist? And just an aside to that, you constantly talk of the economy in terms of constant iteration. You repeat that it's an iterative process. And even when we're talking of mapping of the village land, in the case of Egypt, you mention it as an abstraction created by the repetition of their removal from reality. So what kind of repetition and where exactly is this happening, if not discursive or embodied? Thank you.
John Michael?
Oh, my turn? Okay. So first, thank you. I just wanted to say first, I really enjoyed, the sort of ANT and STS approach, specifically in the first chapter. I just thought it was really, really profound to see the connections between the various actors, or maybe characters, seeing how they are linked in sometimes weird, sometimes funny, kind of like the example of the guy who lost his fingers and in the machine, he's working with sugar, and he's kills himself because of a collapse in the sugar market that's tied directly to Egypt. It's really interesting to see these sorts of connections, not only because they're entertaining, but they help us, look at such black box, maybe not entertaining, but they allow us to see like these black boxes, which, posit themselves as inert and, just as they are, as, the sort of connections that are behind them. So that aside, I wanted to talk, because we had a class with Henny where we talked a little bit about your work and sort of major takeaways, and I wanted to talk kind of about what we talked about in class and what I took away. And I thought the two main ideas that we talked about in class were these notions of durability and capitalization. I found the first a little bit easier to grasp, durability in terms of these socio-technical apparatuses that are made, and you can see them most concretely in notions of infrastructure. Use the example of steel being more durable than other ones, more durable than iron, more durable than wood, and this notion of durability allows you to start thinking about future, and allows you to start expecting that this future will be there and you can rely upon that. And this goes into the second notion of capitalization. You talk about capitalization as the possibility to convert a future income into a payment in the present. And this is a specific interaction in which people are viewing time differently. And when they're viewing future, they're working with this future in mind, and they're working in ways to use various socio-techno-political forms in order to fix those futures, and in order to make the future how they need it to be in order to make these sort of financial gains. And then importantly, they're using that to make gains in the present moment. So these are the two main terms that we picked out, durability and capitalization. And I think on their own, they're quite powerful and relatively easy to understand. But where these chapters challenge us is their interactions with one another. Seeing how these two notions are interlinked and related to one another, and sort of use one another to make specific realities real. You talk about how the durability of infrastructure allows us to make certain futures more certain. So if we take the railroad, for instance, this is a concrete example, building a railroad, or even the example you use in the book, the Aswan Dam, these give a guarantee of certain concrete realities upon which you can make money and build future things, such as plantations. And that's where you start to get into the colonial, and that ties into the colonial that allow for this and also further fuel this. But I think where we start to get confused, and where I think the sort of interesting things is in chapter 2, when you start seeing things and durability in less concrete forms. So we're talking about capitalization in things that are less tangible. And I think specifically you're talking about money and notions of credit that are really future looking, and you posit seeing money as it typically is, based on the typical notions of money, that has its real value and that it's this equalizer. You push back on this and you see that this is not really how people are using money. They're using money more as a sort of credit system, and they're making these forms of money so that they can use things in the future. And I think it's really interesting that if we look at the money, as you suggest, and we see money as being a form of credit and just a system of IOUs that we both organize ourselves around and are organized by, I think that's really profound. And again, I think that what Henny was talking about in class about this was, it really causes us to pause from when we're thinking about how capitalist systems are organized, and it really confuses our notions of just Marxist interpretations of capital, because this notion of accumulation and this sort of the past allows us to make these presents, but you're suggesting quite the opposite. And I don't know what to take away from that, but I think it's quite important. So I have 2 questions in mind. The first is talking about these notions of durability and capitalization. If they are interdependent things, because the way that you talk about it in the book, or in the 2 chapters, is that they go hand in hand with one another. You can't have durability without sorts of capitalization. My question is, not necessarily which comes first, because in some places it seems like durable things allow for capitalization to occur, but then in other ways, the durability of things like credit allow for you to make these durable infrastructures. And I guess the easy question is a chicken egg, which is coming first, but obviously it seems like they're kind of both come together at the same time. So if you could expand on that. And then I have a second question. It's about race too. So this is the seminar series on capitalism, race, and yet the category of race isn't one that you tackle specifically. Like it's not that it isn't there. You talk about slavery and you talk about colonial situations, but race as a category isn't one that you're using specifically when you're analyzing things. And I think we can see this in chapter 1, in which a majority of the sources that you're pulling from are mostly Western voices. I'm not saying this is like a diffusionist account, certainly, because you're talking about how imbricated they are in the colonial, and how these ideas, many of these ideas that we come to think of as Western, are coming out of Egypt and other sort of situations. But I guess my question is, where is race playing into this? Because a number of the books that we've looked at in this series talk about how race is constitutive in terms of how people are making these capitalist assumptions and thinking about capitalism. So I guess my question is, where do you see race coming in? Do you think it's constitutive? Do you think it's a byproduct of these sorts of things? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. So do you want to maybe selectively answer some of those
just
questions?
5 minutes or so.
Yeah, I mean 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll open it up. So everybody else, please prepare your comments and your questions.
Well, thanks. Those are wonderful questions. I can't really do justice to them, so I will be selective in answering them. Maybe I'll take first your question about an effect, because it does provide a way into some of the other issues. I mentioned this briefly in the lecture last night, why I talk about, in earlier writings, about the state as an effect, even back in when I was writing Colonizing Egypt, and was interested in the emergence of conceptions of culture and identity and so on. I was using it, and today with this notion of the economy. And it actually comes back in its way of answering your first question about binaries, about the deconstruction of binaries and their histories and how power was built into that. To me, the interesting thing is not the binaries that you kind of listed in themselves, and the ease with which one can, what's sometimes misleadingly called, deconstruct them, show them falling apart. It's the question of, given how easy that is, given how easy it is to show how unstable the distinctions are between, let's say, the financial and the real, or any of the others that you listed, how are they so powerful in governing the way we live and even producing structures, or what to appear to us of structures of domination that seem so enduring and so able to reproduce themselves? And it's that, it's the word durability, but not in the sense I was using it elsewhere, that I think the word effect can capture because of its double meaning. It suggests both something that is effective, that is powerful, but also something that is in some sense just an effect, just an appearance. And it's that duality that I'm trying to capture. So, the economy on one level is just a representation of things. It's just a compilation of statistics, and yet it has this enormously powerful way of seeming to represent the very structure of our material lives. So your question in relation, so that's partly an answer to your question about binaries, but it's also a question to your answer about where does it exist? And the answer to where does it exist is that it doesn't. Because, of course, that kind of thinking deconstructively about binaries comes out of a tradition of thought connected with Derrida and others, where you don't start from a question of existence. You start, if you like, from a question of performance, of the production of effects, identities, and so on. And a notion of existence, of a sort of stable, self-contained being, would be one of the products of that effect, and that obviously a very powerful idea and a lot of philosophical thought. Not many people take it to write about dams in Egypt, but that's the kind of thing that I try and do. But Judith Butler is doing that with a notion of the body and gender, and others are doing it in other kinds of ways. And while there's differences, I think maybe if I refer to some of those other kinds of people who write this way around the notion of an effect and of forms of performance, I don't use the word performance. I'm too technical for that. But in the interest of time, I won't talk about your question about time, but I'm sure it'll come up again. I liked your phrase about the future being imprisoned by the present, but partly because I actually write it the other way around, the present being imprisoned by the future. That we shouldn't think of the future simply as a sort of range of possibilities we might choose from, but rather as something already captured, that is through these forms of durability. Let me take up this question of the relationship that John Michael asked between durability and capitalization. So part of the reason I became dissatisfied with framing this project too much around the question of durability, although it's still there and it's still central to it, is it's not just durability. Obviously, the world has known many kinds of durable ways of building and organizing and laying out forms of authority and power. Institutions could be built that would last for 500 years or 1,000 years. Institutions like the Waqf in the Middle East, in the Islamic world, and many others, and that could find ways of creating enduring systems of revenue and payment and so on that could endure over time. So the endurance itself, durability, is not enough. I was kind of interested in giving a sort of technical dimension to what I was talking about, and the durability of those materials seemed part of that. But it only works, and I think, John Michael, your question brings it out, if you connect the durability of processes to the possibility of capitalization. In other words, if forms of durability do give you abilities to control revenue over long periods of time, what is the process that allows you to convert that control over the future into revenue in the present? And that needs specific kinds of legal structure. So the rise of the joint stock company, of the large business corporation in the late 19th century, requires a whole series of changes in the nature of what a share is. Prior to the, I mentioned this briefly, prior to the 1860s, 1870s, a share is just a claim on the physical property of a business. It's transformed into property in forever, existing forever, unlike physical claims on buildings, existing forever over the revenues or the profits of that business. And that's a very significant legal transformation. If you combine that with a mode of taking those shares that represent a claim on a future income and making them liquid, in the sense that you can easily transfer them from person to person, also a very difficult thing to do with older forms of business. It could be done, but it wasn't, as it were, what they existed for. In other words, if you can create something like a stock market, then that combination of durability and liquidity is the way in which that future revenue can be acquired and sold on and traded and profited from in the present. So durability alone, and I think you're right to point this out, is not a sufficient way to understand what's changing. It's these modes of capitalization, of capturing in the future and making liquid. And that actually relates back to the question of time, because one of the things that happens is that time takes on these different aspects. One of a durability of control, but the other, the very fact that that control is not absolute, is subject to forms of uncertainty, means that when you make it liquid, the value of it as a liquid claim is itself uncertain. But then that means that over time it can increase and fall in value, and you get another relationship time, not that of the sort of reliable earnings into the future, but the speculative time of the ability to change things. I shouldn't go on too long. I do want to just say one thing about that perhaps relates partly to the question of race and partly to the question of the related question of the effect of this on farmers, on small merchants, on some kind of agency. I can't do justice to both. You're right, I don't have race as much of a category. I'm interested in it. I'm interested in the way it becomes sort of newly deployed in the second half of the 19th century in Egypt that are completely different from what one finds in the first half of the century, and particularly towards the turn of the century. And I'm interested in the way in which part of the crisis of the mid-20th century, with the birth of the economy, is not just a crisis of colonialism, but the crisis of race as a sort of normalized way of explaining the order of the world, because it was quite clear up through the 20s and 30s that it made sense to divide the world into these white-dominated imperial territories, and their existence and their order and their regulation could be explained and ordered on the basis of a concept of race, which of course has an older history, but it becomes central to the organization of international politics. Bob Vitalis, fellow historian of Egypt, has written a very interesting history of this in international relations, pointing out that one of the flagship journals of international relations was originally called the Journal of Race Development, which was how the very field, he argues, of international relations comes into being, understanding and explaining the world in terms of the problem of race development. That gets a bit embarrassing after the Nazi genocide and some of this coming home, as it were, to Europe. And so after the Second World War, it has to be recast. And I think the invention, because you've got the co-invention of the economy and the notion of development. So there's the economy, but there's also notions that other people don't actually have an economy yet. And economics itself is one of the last strongholds of sort of eugenics thinking in the first half of the 20th century, or maybe not the last, but one of the key places, and how to transpose that racist and eugenicist thought into a different kind of science. Economics does the work for you. It explains the backwardness of people in a new kind of language. There's lots more I could say in answer to those wonderful questions, but let me stop there so as not to take too much of the time.
Thank you. So I think it's time for questions and comments from the audience. Yeah.
So one of the things that kind of struck me is your focus on durability. And I know you're speaking, it seems almost you're using the idea of physical infrastructure as an allegory to the idea of an endurance and being able to capitalize over time. But in what way was your analysis shaped by the history of transactional durability in terms of limited liability, a security of ownership, and the ability for a transaction to persist over the course of a project? So you brought up the idea of Sharia, for example. One of the things that distinguish between like transactional law as it emerged in Italy, France, and the United Kingdom, as well as what existed in the Islamic world, was this idea of continuous ownership. So you knew who the owners of an investment were going to be, or were able to project it further over time. Does that legal history factor into your analysis at all, or is this into the weeds, so to speak, compared to where you really want to take the book up? That's it.
I've got a few questions, but I'll keep them brief. I basically want to ask the Marxist kind of set of questions. So I think that there are three questions really. I think the first one is about kind of epochs and periodization. That it does seem to me that you actually have you're re-periodizing, but using similar kinds of breaks to those that have come before. So 1780s to the 1830s, and then again 1860s and after, a kind of second industrial revolution. But you want, at least as I understand it, you want to ground those in newly durable materials that come with new kinds of capitalization, and also with novel forms of political control. So would that be right, or would you? I just basically want to ask how you would periodize. The second thing is, I think the big question for Marxists is going to be something like, while many would follow you in thinking that capitalists have huge freedom of strategic action, in this work at least, it's not clear what kinds of constraints capitalists are under. What they're impelled or motivated or coerced by, and I guess that without that, it's the Marxian sort of framework is capitalists have these constraints on them, and so capitalism has its own laws of motion that impel it in particular directions. And so while I think lots of us would follow you in thinking that freedom of strategic action is much greater than someone like Robert Brenner would think, it's not clear in this what the impulsions are, and therefore it becomes difficult to think about. I guess it's a two-part question, like what are the impulsions on capitalists, and therefore what are the systematic dynamics that capitalism has in your new kind of rendering of temporality. And then the final one really kind of leading off of that is, I guess, how you would kind of construct the differences between different kinds of capitalists. Clearly there's a difference in your theory between what banks do and what entrepreneurs do. But I guess I wanted you to speak a little bit more about how you would understand that. Are they subject to different kinds of constraints, different kinds of impulsions, liquidity and insolvencies, like often a way that sort of financially inflected theories try and take this? And, you know, would you stick to the kind of division, the classic division of money dealing capital, industrial capital, commercial capital, and then finance capital as a kind of bridge between different versions of those, or just generally to speak about that? And then the last comment is basically that I think there's much more kinship in the sort of in what you're arguing and the kind of Marx-Hilferding line, I would say, where fictitious capital is really what happens when stocks and shares can be traded, and therefore you get a doubling of both the asset as like a technological asset and a second thing that can be traded without trading that underlying technological asset. And I wondered is that where you're going, or do you think there are still differences?
Come to you in a sec, but just to promote also discussing amongst each other, I just wanted to maybe add something to Gautam's comment, or maybe even respond to Gautam's comment on the question of what compels the capitalist. So my reading of in one of the chapters at least was you talk about the Industrial Revolution as a kind of detour, but what propels that detour, or sort of compels capitalists to move towards sort of production and factory system and so on, is the revolutions of the 1780s and 1790s. So is that one way perhaps to address the question of sort of what compels capitalists?
Outside of these like forcing moments, I guess, like outside of these big epochal, like if I'm a capitalist every day. Right, yeah, I mean you said compel, so I assume that meant sort of forcing, but I think it seems to me that what you're looking for is a kind of systematicity that perhaps Mitchell's work sort of militates again. Maybe it's a story that is slightly more sort of contingent, but anyway, I think Gabe wanted to
Sure, it's
comment.
part of the same conversation. I mean, I think the not on the contingent level of events like the revolutions of the 1780s and 90s, like the fact that fictitious capital or interest-bearing capital has circulated at such greater volumes over the past 40 years because of falling profits in manufacturing in the global north, I think would be an example of the kinds of system-level explanations that Gautam might be interested in. But I had a question about it's tied up with the question of effect, but still following on from this discussion of fictitious capital, which is whether you ever felt, Professor Mitchell, that fetish was a useful category for you, because sometimes I think with a lot of discussion of finance, we can sort of assume that we sort of take the image that it projects for itself, that it is in fact disconnected from the quote-unquote real economy, as though that were reality, in contrast to the way that we know it's operated historically, in the way that you even show in these chapters, that there are all these ways in which the operations of finance subordinate production and are part of a kind of a circuit or a series of moments in, you could call it value, or you could call it claims on the future. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts about that category, and whether, especially because for a long time, it took me a long time to wrap my head around the way that you used effect in your work, and then later came to theories of the fetish, and I just sometimes thought there might be a productive conversation between the two. Thank you.
Hi. I wanted kind of to fit in this conversation, and also obviously ask a question to Tim, because there was a bit that I'm really sympathetic with this analysis of infrastructural temporalities, and especially infrastructures are time machines to capture the future. But at some points when I was reading the second chapter, I became a bit confused by the claim that when railways were built, the task was not to build railways for the need of railways or canals for the need of canals, but actually the specific durability was a chance for this new opportunity for business. And especially consider that Henny mentioned the idea that your work is attentive to the kind of contingency of the way in which capitalism developed. It strikes me that this question erases any kind of contingency and instead creates a system that risks almost reproducing a kind of Adam Smithian sense of there is a nature to capitalism and a nature to profit seeking, which is all encompassing. And I wonder how, obviously I know that that's not what you want to do, and so I wonder how we retain this kind of, you talk about the effect as being something that is precarious. How do we retain this effectiveness of the precarious effect? The effect is we are led to think that there is this kind of unitary linear goal of profit seeking in the building of the railways that somehow trumps everything else. This is to say that I am very sympathetic with this kind of neo-materialism against historical materialism, which is obviously what this claim is doing, but I'm confused about the kind of totalitarianness.
Thank you.
I actually want to kind of contradict myself and sort of agree with you a little bit. And just go back to this detour that you call the Industrial Revolution. And I was sort of thinking through after class about how it seemed that at one point, before you wrote these chapters, you wanted to frame the Industrial Revolution as a kind of great exception, right? So pushing back against this idea that it is the paradigm for how we understand capitalism, this productivist, factory-centered understanding. So previously you seem to be suggesting that it's this kind of historical exception, but what you're doing in these chapters is in some ways telling us that it's the norm, that it's actually part of this longer history of capitalization or revenue capture from the future into the present, if I've got that right. So now I'm sort of contradicting myself. Is it part of a kind of almost a universal history of how capitalism operates? And is it fair to say that you're displacing the word capitalism with capitalization as a way to help us think about a process that we can see over time in various different kind of historical spaces? So yeah, if you could just comment on the universal versus the particular and how you're framing the Industrial Revolution. Yep.
I wondered about the realm of the kind of the non-durable, or what is imagined to be less the non-durable, or what is thought to be non-durable, or kind of less predictable, less calculable, and so forth. The potential kind of things which might have to be addressed, which cannot be so easily kind of captured or kind of defined as something which are durable infrastructure. And three come to mind. I mean, there are kind of ways in which all of them are addressed. One is innovation, and intellectual property claims clearly play a part there, and kind of development of standards. And of course, you've written on Edison before, and but there's a continual kind of issue there, of course, with Schumpeter and the question of which the kind of constant destabilization which innovation might produce, and how that's written to the history. The second one, which is something you've also written about, really, is, of course, ironically, and as we know today, after all, the construction of the railways, the reconstruction of the development of mines creates a kind of mass working class organisations which may prevent other forms of destabilisation of the future. And then the third thing, which you introduced the kind of question of climate change, but from the late 20th century onwards, and increasingly, obviously, in the very recent past, it can be no longer assumed that the natural world is as stable as it was once imagined to be. I mean, up until the 1940s, it was possible to talk about resources as if they were kind of naturally distributed. But increasingly in the late 20th century, there's kind of increasing notion that actually the natural world is kind of absolutely entangled and constantly destabilized by the forms of investment which are being encouraged. So, yes, I mean, all of those, of course, these instabilities are addressed, but how do you see they being written into the larger narrative?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of jump off of the last part of your question about climate change and the sort of late 20th century realization about, like that we are, like what we are doing is putting the earth in trouble. And something very strange happens in like the 1970s, like I guess late 60s, which is the rise of resilience theory, right? And I'm thinking about how basically, like, I think through your work we can really also try to understand the ways in which, like, the challenges that the climate crisis were predicted to be posing in the 1970s created also its own forms of durabilities in the form of resilience theory and in the form of like creating different forms of technopolitical structures that can withstand the challenges posed by climate change. One of these technologies are like weather derivatives, right? It's not just about like the earth surviving, but the sort of like the process of capitalization that you are talking about surviving, surviving through the kinds of scarcities that were coming to be realized. So I was wondering if that's a shift from like durability to resilience is something you've thought about or would think about. That's my question.
I'm going to jump off of actually both of those. So most of the derivatives, options, indices, most of the futures financial trading actually trades not of durability, but of extremely small changes that constantly happen. So massive fluctuations, arbitrage of those massive fluctuations. And it is, in a sense, the less durable something is, the better you can bet on it via futures, derivatives, etc. How does that fit within your schema?
My question is kind of building on these a little bit.
Can you speak just a little bit louder, please?
Sure, maybe I'll take it. Well, I have a question about like obsolescence. Like when I think about the future and the kind of idea of growth, part of that depends on the lack of durability, the idea of things breaking and constantly needing to be replaced. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how obsolescence kind of factors into that, and the sense of which that's speeding up in terms of the kind of business cycles and things like fast fashion and whatever else. And then related to that, building on the last question, you know, this idea of the way in which business is trying to re-engineer risk. So instead of kind of having to own the fleet of vehicles, you're trying to get owners to do your work for you. You know, trying to shift production out of factories and into kind of more distributed systems where you don't own the things, that the equipment. So I wonder if what you're talking about is something that was contingent in a particular time period, or you think it's kind of continued?
I think it was really fascinating in the first chapter how you spoke about the Aswan Dam not only being engineered, but the finance for it being engineered as well through these irrigation certificates. I just wanted to ask, surely these irrigation certificates were they not an exception to how capital was engineered, or was it just used in other Middle Eastern countries as well? Because it's quite a fascinating concept of irrigation certificates for money, for like land that would be taxed in the future.
João?
I have a question about time. So basically, taking from what you said about...
But also, if you would, maybe stand up so people at the back can...
Well.
Sorry.
It's a bit awkward.
Sorry.
So, because you mentioned that we must be attentive to the fabricated effects of the future as we have been to the fabricated effects of the past, meaning that we take the past as in the general assumption of the past as real and the future as fictitious. And then from that idea comes the idea or power mechanisms that use the future as a way to control the present and so on, the question of capitalization. But my question was, as much as we take the past for real, the past is disputed, obviously. We are in this room right now disputing the past. There are many versions of the past. And my question is, your account of the future, of this future that is produced to feed on the present, impoverishing the future, and in this sort of dialectic process. Is there one single future? And in this sense, I don't know. I mean, I haven't read the whole book, so that is. But surely the future is the most disputed thing there is. As in, like, there are many disputes over the future, many accounts of the future, how many articles saying reimagining the future. In that sense, and in that sense, is there not a risk in your account? Or I want to know more about your perception of time, of how time works in this sense, the past and the future, of the future being seen as homogeneous and not as sort of undisputed, letting, and so, yeah, about this question of the dispute of the future, and not a single account. Yeah, that's my question.
Ada, I'm going to make you stand up too.
Do I have to? Anybody see? Well, actually, I don't know if this can wrap this last bit a bit up, but I'm curious to your literal practical approach to historical primary sources, because I mean I'm reading Professor Hochberg's work on Becoming Palestine, and she is working on historical archives for the future, but she's literally looking at experimental archives that are kind of already meant to be for the future. But in your case, how are you analyzing historical sources, or how are we supposed to, taking your new approach and this new interpretation, how are we gonna then do that? How do you go to an archive and look, or also what about non-economical sources or stuff that doesn't talk about the economy or whatever it was before that? Are we also supposed to interpret that with a different temporal sort of conceptualization? Or how are you doing this?
Yeah, I think it's a great final question to wrap up this part of the comments and questions with. And I also was thinking about whether your account is provoking us to think of a sort of materialist understanding of the future in the way that we do the past and the present. But yeah, maybe selectively you could spend 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay. So maybe I'll just begin at the end there with the question about approach to sources, non-economic sources. There's a mixture of sources, and that could be much wider and much larger than it is. And they range from the writing of medieval Arabic historians who've provided me with a much better understanding of the way in which this earlier system of agriculture worked, that persisted, even into the 19th century, that hasn't really been written about at all, with the exception of one Egyptian historian, a guy called Abdul Hamid Subhi Nasif, who's written a book on Egyptian irrigation in the 19th century. I'm trying to remember its title. I think it begins with Mashrat al-Rayf al-Qantas or something like that, which is the one source I know based on primary sources that actually talks about this other system of irrigation I'm talking about, though he talks about it mostly as a set of projects of Muhammad Ali, a lot of well digging and sourcing of animals to expand the system of well digging without actually analyzing its earlier history. Another kind of source which I don't use, which I've used in earlier work, and that it could be used extensively to capture this moment in Egyptian history, is literary sources. Some of you will know the book by Elizabeth Holt, if you work on this period of Egyptian history, which has precisely sort of read the Egyptian novel and Egyptian writers in this period. This period of these new kinds of financial engineering and experiment, to read in their work a reflection and an addressing, and I haven't referenced her work yet. And I even think of some of the Egyptian writers and novelists that I was reading when I wrote Colonizing Egypt, Ibrahim Muwahili and some of the others, and realizing how much themes of time and time travel and experiences of time were part of their work. And all that could get in, and this chapter could get much longer than 60 pages, and I certainly want to get some of that in. And it's partly a matter of reading them differently, but it's also partly a matter of seeing what one learns from them that would alter my own account of this. So that leads to a number of different questions which had to do with the ways in which, partly Andrew Barry's question about what is less predictable, what is less calculable, which was connected with Joao's question on the conception of time, and others. And I think that's all very useful. And I think because of this sort of starting point with durability, I've been less attentive to the non-durable, to the way in which durability is disturbed by forms of destabilization, including the obvious one that is that the durable schemes themselves enable railways, allow forms of worker industrial action on a scale that simply wasn't possible before. And I need to work that into this this thinking about durability in better ways than I have now. I think that's a very helpful aspect of this, and it relates to the question from the back about breakage and obsolescence. These are all themes that I can sort of touch on, but I haven't sort of turned into conceptual themes in quite the same way. I mean, some of the best work in history of technology focus, recently, including, of course, our colleague here in London, shock of the old. Yeah, David Edgerton. Precisely focus their histories of technology on what is on aspects of breakage and breakdown and the sort of getting away from the innovative aspect of the technical. And I think that's such an important part of writing these kinds of technical histories that could be better emphasized. There were a couple of questions related, Lale's question and the question from the back, the one mention of weather derivatives about which, from a different point of view, relate to this question of sort of predictability and durability, as opposed to the way those things are disrupted, whether by the unexpected or the forms of resistance they make possible, or how the natural world that used to be sort of a stable source of something, it can no longer be treated that way. I think I've probably got to bring that out more, but to me, what I'm trying to do here to sort of capture that more is see that as a sort of that ability to profit from the unstable and the unexpected is a sort of secondary phenomenon made possible by the forms of durability that you construct. I mean, not only by that, because as with the invention of derivatives themselves, the ability to calculate and price that instability is just as important as the fact that you can now measure instability, because you can measure it against the stability or the durability of the long-term revenue. So I agree these things are absolutely essential, and my sort of broader understanding is that once you've set up or made more extensive these modes of capturing and living off the future, if you're going to profit from them in the present, they've got to be discountable. They've got to be things that you can sell at a discount in the present, because nobody's going to buy the future at full price. It's a complicated but simple idea in a way. So you realize the income from the future by selling it, but you sell it at a discount. So somebody is going to profit by that initial act, but also by then purchasing a future income at a discounted price. But then a third person is going to profit from the ability to speculate in the way the value of that future claim is going to go up and down with unexpected setbacks, occurrences, and so on, and you can bet for and against. You can now profit not just from the fact that some future claim is going to increase in value, but you can even profit from the fact that it might fall in value or collapse. So all those forms of instability that now become sort of measurable in new kinds of ways become themselves a source of profit built upon the underlying durability that you've constructed out of these technical innovations. The question of the natural world not being as stable as it was thought to be, as a general point, I think that's really fruitful to think about. But one of the reasons I was interested in retelling yet again this story of Egypt's agricultural transformation in the late 19th, early 20th century, and it's a story that's been told much more extensively and much better in Jennifer Durr's new book, The Lived Nile, is to really grasp, as I do in the opening paragraphs of the first chapter, the scale of the ecological destruction that was wrought. And if you think about some of the consequences that may follow from some of the worst effects of climate change, assuming that the most cataclysmic are avoided and we just deal with the almost as cataclysmic. These were already inflicted in the colonial period on populations around the world. I mean, the mass displacement of people due to climate change because of flooding. The entire people of Nubia have already experienced that. And their entire homeland flooded and removed from the map. And there's many other examples you can think. The level of many other of these so-called side effects of technical transformations, the forms of poisoning and disease and loss of the fertility of the land, and effect after effect of this re-engineering of an entire river system, I think match, at least at a local level, some of this sort of sense of the natural world being less predictable. Of course, the interesting thing is, in this case, it was engineered to make the natural world more predictable, to remove the floods so that you could store the waters, so that you wouldn't have to deal with unpredictability anywhere at all. And it involved this kind of rewriting of the history of Egypt to show that Egypt was a place that constantly experienced over centuries drought, not only drought, but devastation and famine, and that this was the environmental uncertainty that the dam had to be built to prevent, which clearly from the record, and we've got Lorenzo here, who's my source on this beyond what I'm able to read myself, is at the very least a vast exaggeration of what life in the Nile Valley in the across centuries was like. Let me I'm sorry I can't do justice to all the questions, so just the last thing, some of Gelton's questions, which also came up with Gabe's question, maybe Gabe and the fetish. Is it a useful word? It probably is, but not in ways I'm capable at this point in thinking at. I do like the fact that, first of all, that Marx had to turn to a religious term, and of course he says, to make sense of this, I'm going to have to go to religion, but what does that mean? And second, that he first thinks about trees and fetishes in one of his very first ever pieces of writing, the article he publishes when he's a young journalist in Germany, and about the theft of wood. And this, of course, is because forests are being turned into these new kinds of financial investments. And it is the place where modern forms of calculation of value through the process of capitalization is first worked out in the industry of German forestry. So you've got a sort of moment that is at the very heart, even before the joint stock company, where suddenly, because of the kinds of investments in forests, you've got to figure out, well, what is the relative value of cutting these trees down versus letting them grow for another 50 years? You've got to use methods of discounting and capitalizing the future. And if you can do that, then you can then decide that no way can these peasants go out and collect wood anymore. And that's precisely what Marx describes as treating trees literally as fetishes. So there's a history of the fetish directly connected to the history of discounting and capitalization that's interesting. In terms of Gautam's questions about epochs, what is the compulsions that capitalists are under? I mean, I think Henny's right that I do have a slightly more sort of contingent notion of that, or perhaps a sense of the ability of people bent on forms of extraction to find ever new ways of doing it, and that some of the constraints that are usually thought of, such as profit and maybe its declining rate, they would have no particular idea of, either individually or collectively, perhaps at various moments, certainly not compared to the other kinds of decisions they're making. And I think one of the decisions they're making is that they've been forced into this thing called an industrial revolution. And I've got lots of stuff I haven't been able to quote from some of the sources from this quarry bank mill that figures in every single history of the Industrial Revolution. And the sons of the founder of this first and largest of all the cotton mills hate it. And they say, all I've done is I spent my whole life financing. They don't describe it as manufacturing, they call it financing. And I want to get out. I'm going to move to the Lake District and live a good life. It's horrible stuff. And they all do it. And this goes back to a famous Emmanuel Wallerstein article. Every capitalist wants to become, every bourgeois wants to become a rentier. It is hard work to make money out of industry. You've got a complex, competitive process that is dangerous and dirty. And that's why, now I haven't worked into the story, when we get to Ernest Crozier, the man who is sort of brings about essentially the 1907 world financial crisis, and hence the creation of the Federal Reserve and many other things, by his own taking of his own life, that when the police inspection is done, he's got this artificial finger with which he somehow pulled the trigger. He lost his finger repairing the sugar refining equipment, because he was actually an engineer. He was kind of chief engineer of the company who got to take it over. And, that is, for me, in this story, and I haven't been able to develop it yet, the problem with industrialization. It's a place of accidents, of horrible kinds of working conditions, even for those who are just the engineers and the managers, and turns the whole, say, refining company into this business of speculating in sugar futures, because that's a way to get rich a lot quicker. So that doesn't quite answer Gautam's question about periodization, and nor about what is driving them, but I'll leave it there because I'd come back.
You can come back to that. So we're going to have a second round, a shorter round of questions and comments. Yasmin?
Hi.
So between the medieval that you've alluded to and the very modern story you're telling us is the sort of early modern portion we haven't really talked about. You did mention the WRCHRs earlier, and I think there have been a lot of questions about how unpredictable was revenue tied to agricultural production actually. And I think we just don't know the answer to that really, because Egypt for a long time, 1695 is when they had this new kind of regulation in the Ottoman Empire, when taxation of land was not, the tax farming of land was not going to be on the basis of 1-year contracts, but could be obtained for the lifetime of someone who was going to be participating and winning an auction. for the money that they would be paying upfront for the sort of predicted value of that land, let's say. So it seems to me that, and this was particularly common as far as I read, and I've just read very cursorily right now in the context of Egypt, that lifetime grants, tax farming grants were given to notables in Egypt, it seems like. So there seems to be that even without the durability of these new kinds of materials, there were a class of people who were interested in predicting the future value of agricultural land and were betting on that, betting on a particular, not betting in a sense, but like were trying to win the auction by offering up the highest upfront price they could pay for that land. So I'm wondering now, is this story you're telling us a kind of rupture then in the history of a longer history of capitalization in Egypt? Or do you see that more as a kind of question of degree? Is it a more exacerbation of something that has already been going on? So yeah, how big of a break is this really?
Yes, at the back there.
Hi, Professor Mitchell. Thank you so much for the wonderful chapters and for the presentation. I'm not a political economist, so my question might be a little irrelevant to the discussion that's been taking place. I hope not. But it struck me when I'm reading about this idea of durability that there is a tension, because durability, specifically in an Egyptian context, I would say, is both a marker of an ancient civilization that is, in a sense, timeless, but also it's a kind of a futurity that promises a certain economic development and a capture of revenue. So I see it as both this idea that doesn't necessarily just bring us to the past, but is also, as I said, a timeless temporality. And then also, as you say, it's a futurity. So do you recognize that tension? Do you agree that there is a tension there? And
sorry, between a timeless past and what? And the things
and the future, yeah. So this idea of economic progress, economic development, of infrastructure being durable, and therefore, hence modernity, for example. So I guess a bigger question would be, is Egypt a contingent or necessary to this kind of process of capitalization? Thank you.
Building on earlier questions around like contingency and destabilization, I wanted to go a bit back to your work on carbon democracy and ask a question about political and material power. One of the questions of contingency, and also someone asked a question about the certificates of the Aswan Dam, right? And I find this question actually very interesting, because you write actually that at the beginning they had a kind of problem to actually find someone to pay, kind of for the services or something like that. And then you write later that it's actually a tax that then people have to pay to receive the water from the dam, right, when they release it. That's how I understood it. So I'm wondering here, like, whether this like kind of tax regime that comes in there actually speaks to the relevance of political power that you don't really like talk a lot about. I feel you talk a lot about the power of finance and durability and kind of like the private entrepreneur and everything, but what is the role of the state and political power that is institutionalized in actually making those practices durable themselves and allowing like the circuits of finance to actually take place in space and time? And related to that, the question of material power, you also write that actually the fertility of the grounds of the Nile are decreasing, like because of the dam and because of the nutrients not getting through anymore that as they have been in history. But you don't really elaborate whether this actually turns into any like crisis or loss of profits or kind of like a displacement of people from their lands or something. Like, it seems like there is a kind of problem there with like nature not functioning in the way in which it was kind of imagined by the capitalists who were investing in that. But then you don't really elaborate like what the consequences are. And I think there's like a couple of moments where we see that there could be a contingency or there could be a problem there, and there could be a question of power and pushing back against finance, but you don't really go into that much. So I wanted to ask on those 2 points.
I just want to jump in there, and then Sarah, maybe you can come in, because I think it links to what's just been said. You mentioned carbon democracy, and I think it's been a question, I don't know if it came up in the podcast interview, but there's been a question of how this project links to the sort of trajectory of your work, and as the author of sort of colonizing Egypt, and then rule of experts, carbon democracy, this question of the colonial, which you've brought up in various places here, but I don't think you've actually tackled directly. I'd be interested in hearing more about. And we had a discussion in class where we were sort of thinking together, okay, on the one hand you tell us that this tendency to build sort of large-scale structures, these infrastructural projects that are durable, that allow for capitalization, are colonizing in nature. And with that understanding of sort of colonialism, we're still within the realm of a kind of within the realm of space, so it's a kind of spatial understanding of the colonial, which I think partially we saw in your work in colonizing Egypt. So colonialism as a process of kind of reorganization, reordering the world that leads to these metaphysical distinctions, or the appearance that there is a metaphysical distinction in the world between ideas and matter and so on and so forth. But at the same time, in talking about the capture of the future, are you suggesting that we might need to have a more sort of temporal understanding of the colonial, and move away from its sort of spatiality? Is there a sort of colonization of the future that we might want to be thinking about? So yeah, I think it would be really great for us, especially some of the students in this class, if you could sort of more square on, sort of head on, squarely rather, tell us how capitalization links to your understanding of the colonial.
All right, thank you. There's so much to think with. I think just one of the things that I'm like stuck at right now is thinking about this idea of industrialization as detour. And I guess I'm coming back to comments about sort of why capitalists keep going back to kind of credit. And Henny's point about universalism, I think they're pretty well connected. I guess my question is, I'm really sympathetic to this idea of thinking about kind of the coincidental, almost accidental kind of falling into the Industrial Revolution because of crises around credit, which is really interesting, at least if I'm understanding this correctly. And this idea of kind of capturing revenue from the future as mobilizing particular energies that then kind of coincidentally come together into industrialization, I think is very fruitful. I think what I'm a little bit concerned about, though, in this kind of framework, is that we miss out on really capturing the power and the effect of these coincidental moments. So I think it's really helpful for us in terms of kind of, and sorry, I'm kind of working all this through, but it's very helpful in terms of thinking about, like, if we put on the lens of this idea of capturing the future, we're going to see the Industrial Revolution very differently. And I think I'm very sympathetic to that. I think what I worried about, or I guess I kind of want to push to ask sort of what are we seeing differently about kind of the effect of these very powerful sort of it's a node, right? The industrialization erupts into something. And so it's kind of a question about continuity and rupture, right? Because if we're, there's a lot of continuity in the story, but there's obviously kind of the production of so many things at different nodes that are transforming the economic, but the political and power dynamics in really interesting ways. And I guess I'm curious about how you kind of see this project to talk about temporality, futurity in these ways as opening up new ways of thinking of the political. And hence kind of, I guess I'm pushing a little bit against the idea of saying industrialization is a detour because I'm a little bit worried about missing the power dynamics that are produced through these kind of moments. Hope that makes sense.
Last chance.
Routine.
Martine, go.
Just a similar. I mean, I had a question about if the sort of factory wage labour system is one means of many of capitalization. What is particular about it in terms of producing an effect that makes it synonymous with capitalism? Is there something particular that you see that means that it's sort of we have this similar effect being produced? And then also had a second question about durability. Should we see durability as an effect that can't be taken for granted, and that I think you hint at this in terms of talking about visibility and legibility, and to what degree, in terms of we can't just assume durability from the materiality, but also in erasing its breakdown and erasing this sort of instability that takes active work on the ground. So how important is legibility and visibility in producing this effect of durability?
Selective answers to some of those questions.
Okay, well, there's several overlaps among the questions, so maybe I'll try and talk about that, because there's a set of questions, Yasmin, going back to earlier periods. Johan Henny, that I didn't answer from the first round about the seeming contradiction between the notion of contingency with the sense that I'm seeing all of capitalism as essentially the same process from early modern or even earlier times through around this process of capture of the future. So there's a sort of conflict between those two, and Martine's and Sarah's most recent question. So I might actually take them in reverse. So Martine just asked what's particular about the effect produced by the factory and wage labor. So I'd say one way to think about that is what's produced is the effect of wage labor, the concept that becomes absolutely central to thinking through a concept of labor and the concept of the wage, and the concept of the wage as being the thing that is exchanged for commodities in a way that helps reformulate both classical political economy, but then of course the works of Marx. And what the concept that Marx and later Marxist theories draw out of that is the notion of abstract labor, that the regularization and the treating of equivalent of multiple different kinds of labor as all expressions of apparently the same abstract thing is part of the way an entire system of domination is constructed, which I would only modify by saying I don't think that abstract labor was produced on the factory floor. Engels worked in Manchester, but not on factories. I mean, the family did own a factory, but he worked, as I mentioned in passing, in the business of financing the factories. And one of his great moments was when he got admitted to membership of the Royal Exchange, the Cotton Exchange in Manchester. And more broadly, I could connect that, but I'll leave that point to connect later. But this system of truck that I describe, of paying people in credit and realizing a surplus through that working of that credit system, where people don't receive, as it were, real money, they receive credit money, and then they spend that money on the product of their own labor in the shops owned by the same merchant or his friends. Creates such crisis and such political opposition that Parliament has to step in and pass a series of these truck acts to prevent it being done, and simultaneously, in those, or the continuation of those, pass this factory legislation to organize and try and legislate around the standardization of the working day, the hour, the payment of wages, prevent these kinds of credit systems. And of course, the reports of those factory inspectors become one of the main sources for Marx's writing of Capital. So there's a kind of process of abstraction through legislation, an attempt to standardize a process that is itself then partly produced in the abstractness of labor, which doesn't actually correspond to what's happening on the factory floor, where we know from historians actually studied that all kinds of things went on. Not only all these forms of truck and barter and credit that extended way past the passing of the Truck Acts, right through the 19th century, but other ways of organizing labor within the factory, like renting a space within the factory and bringing in your own people, or apprenticeship systems that were still under control of older kind of guild organizations. But it is abstracted partly through the response to the crisis in the forms of legislation into something called labor exchange for a wage, which then becomes understood as this active exchange between equivalents. So that's just sort of one set of thoughts about the particular kinds of effects that are produced out of this. And that relates to Sarah's question about, the consequences of thinking of this as a detour. I think one can combine thinking of it as a detour with thinking of it as something that has profound and unexpected effects. And of course, that's, one can add to my account here Andreas Mahn's account of steam power. That steam power is not the thing driving the Industrial Revolution, but a response to an unexpected effect. You can make all this money by putting large numbers of workers together, but what happens is they get unruly. And the shift, which comes later, largely in the period in the 1820s to 30s, from water-driven industrialization to steam-driven, is because steam allows a greater discipline of a workforce. So this, again, is about how both unexpected consequences and pushback by those who are made subject actually radically reshape. And, a system of water power gives way to a system of steam power. How am I doing? I've got to stop.
Couple minutes.
But
we started a bit late, so...
Okay. And I think this, and there are other kinds of contingent consequences, which, that's one good, Andreas Malm's work is, I think, a good example of how something that was not the driver of the process, was not the intention of the process, steam power, the use of coal to drive manufacturing, comes out of is an unexpected consequence of this reorganization of a credit system. And that there was a question on the back about, again, contingency, which can relate that back to Egypt. I mean, part of the problem with the sort of Industrial Revolution-centric account is that Egypt gets peripheralized in the very way it is told, because it comes into this story as a provider of the cotton that is now necessary because of this process that is driving history of the manufacture of raw cotton. Interestingly, the first guy who ships cotton is a British guy working for Muhammad Ali, and he ships it to pay debts, to realize the debts owed to him by Muhammad Ali, because what he's really done is he's financed the purchase of ships for Muhammad Ali so that he can build a fleet and get involved in the Greek War and other kinds of things. And the guy who finances is given some land. Well, there's no use of land to him in Egypt growing more wheat, which was by far the largest crop grown, because he's got to find some way to move those profits from his financing of shipping back to England. So he says, I'm going to get into cotton production. He's not the only one, and Muhammad Ali is interested for other reasons, but it's the ability of cotton to ship the profits of that shipping back to England that is the motive for the first of this new export of cotton from the 1820s, 1830s. So that's about the sort of contingency as it relates to Egypt. Sorry, I've lost my place. But the early modern, the transformations in tax farming, it's obviously one of the things I'm trying to do is find far more in the way of continuity through these practices of credit and capitalization with what was going on before. Not only in that early modern period in Egypt, for example, but an entire system of commerce and trade across the Islamic world over centuries that is then expanded into Europe, and as well as other forms it takes when the Europeans try and outflank the Islamic world and decide slave plantations is the way to do that. And understanding those, as a lot of the good recent work on slavery does, is something driven by the fact that the enslaved person is something that can be capitalized because they have this lifetime. It may be short, but it's a lifetime of the contributing to the wealth of their owner, and the price of the slave is the capitalized value of that lifetime of labor. It becomes this enormous system. There's a wonderful passage in David Graeber talking about the sort of Atlantic world, sort of this floating system of credit through slaves and through the shipping of commodities and so on, that is driven by these networks of debt. So in the case of 18th century Egypt, there are all kinds of attempts to deal, of course, with the disruptions that are happening because of what's going on in the Atlantic and elsewhere, and to raise revenues in new kinds of ways and to change the way you auction them. The question for me is not that that's not happening, and that the auctioning of the rights to the surplus from a set of villages is one of the ways the state is continuously going to raise revenue, and those are going to change. But yes, one would want to know what was driving those changes and why you switched from a 1 year to a lifetime auction. Is that a sign of the relative weakness of Istanbul in relation to what's going on in Egypt, or is it rather the sign of the increasing stability and profitability of agricultural production in Egypt, so that the lifetime auction actually raises much more money? I mean, those are questions to be investigated, but to me that's fascinating, and I hope you're doing it.
Should we?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for those, very detailed, very precise, very, very generous responses to our questions. And please join me in thanking Professor Mitchell for